October 18, 1945. The transport ship anchored off San Francisco Bay at dawn, and for the first time in 4 years, Nurse Akiko Tanaka stood on the deck of a vessel that was not under attack, in waters that were not contested, approaching a shore where she would not be expected to die. Behind her, 300 Japanese women, nurses, civilians trapped in the Pacific, a handful of female military auxiliaries, stood in silence, watching the city emerge from morning fog like a promise or a threat. They had been told they would be treated as prisoners of war despite the surrender, that they would be held until arrangements could be made for repatriation to Japan. What they had not been told, what Tanaka could not have imagined, was that within hours they would be transported to a medical facility unlike anything they had experienced. A hospital staffed entirely by women, treating only women, an institution that existed because American society possessed such abundance that it could dedicate separate medical infrastructure to half its population. As the ship moved toward dock, Tanaka's hands gripped the railing with fingers that bore scars from 4 years of field surgery, of treating wounded soldiers with insufficient supplies, of amputating limbs without anesthesia because Japanese military medical doctrine prioritized soldiers over everything, including the humanity of those who treated them. She expected imprisonment, possibly harsh treatment, certainly scarcity. She did not expect what awaited her at the U.S. Naval Hospital, Oakland, where the women's wing would introduce her to a vision of medical care and of women's place in society that would transform everything she thought she understood about America and about herself. The context that shaped these women's understanding began not in October 1945, but in the years of total war that had preceded it, years when Japanese military culture had squeezed every resource toward combat effectiveness at the expense of everything else. Tanaka had been trained as a nurse at Tokyo Imperial University before the war, part of a generation of educated Japanese women who represented modernity within a society still deeply traditional. But when war came, that training had been repurposed entirely toward military medicine. She had served in field hospitals in China, in the Philippines, and finally in Okinawa, where the distinction between medical facility and battlefield had effectively ceased to exist. Japanese military medicine operated on principles of scarcity and hierarchy. Officers received treatment before enlisted men, soldiers before civilians, men before women. Medical supplies were chronically insufficient. Morphine was reserved for only the most severe cases. Surgical tools were reused without proper sterilization. Infections were common and often fatal. Female nurses occupied an ambiguous position in this system, necessary for their skills, but subordinate in a military culture that viewed women primarily as supporters of male warriors. They were expected to endure the same hardships as soldiers, to work without complaint despite exhaustion and danger, and to accept that their own health needs were secondary to the mission. Many nurses in Pacific postings had died, not from enemy action, but from malnutrition, disease, and the cumulative effect of working conditions that would have been considered barbaric in peacetime. This was the baseline of experience against which Tanaka and the other women would measure what they encountered. In American captivity, the buses that transported them from the dock to Oakland Naval Hospital on October 19th passed through neighborhoods that seemed impossibly clean and prosperous. Houses with intact windows and fresh paint, streets without rubble, shops with goods displayed in windows, civilians who looked well-fed and moved without the furtive haste that characterized life in bombed-out Japanese cities. The women watched in silence, each cataloging details that challenged what they had been taught about America's home front. Japanese propaganda had portrayed America as a nation brought to its knees by the Pacific War, its economy strained, its people suffering, its resolve weakening. The evidence before their eyes suggested something very different. A nation that had waged global war without apparent domestic sacrifice, that had maintained civilian prosperity while projecting military power across 2 oceans. When the buses passed a grocery store where a woman emerged carrying bags of food, Tanaka noticed that one of the younger nurses began to cry quietly. The contrast between this abundance and the starvation rations that had become normal in Japan was so stark it seemed almost cruel, a reminder of how completely Japan had been defeated not just militarily, but economically, not just in battles, but in the fundamental capacity to provide for its people. The Oakland Naval Hospital Women's Wing was a three-story brick building set apart from the main hospital complex, connected by covered walkways but functionally autonomous. As the Japanese women were processed through intake, they encountered their first surprise. The American nurses conducting the examination were professional, efficient, and more concerned with their health status than their enemy status. Tanaka, whose English was functional, served as translator and watched the American nurses work with an attention born of professional interest. They wore crisp white uniforms that showed no signs of reuse or make-do repairs, carried equipment that was standardized and purpose-built rather than improvised, and moved through procedures with a confidence that came from training and adequate resources. The examination itself was thorough in ways that shocked the Japanese women. Weight and height recorded, blood pressure measured, eyes and ears examined, blood drawn for testing, questions asked about diet and menstruation, and symptoms that Japanese military medicine had considered too trivial to warrant attention. When one of the American nurses noticed scarring on Tanaka's hands and asked in halting Japanese when she had last had a proper medical examination herself, Tanaka realized she could not remember. Nurses, in Japanese military culture, were caregivers who did not receive care, professionals expected to function regardless of their own physical condition. The American assumption that medical personnel also required monitoring and treatment was foreign and, in ways Tanaka was only beginning to process, revelatory. The symbolic object that would come to represent the entire experience of internment at Oakland Naval Hospital was not a weapon or even explicitly military equipment, but something more mundane and perhaps more profound. The clean white sheets that covered every bed in the women's ward. When Tanaka and the other nurses were assigned to a dormitory-style room with 20 beds, each made with cotton sheets that were crisp, unstained, and obviously intended for single use before laundering, several women simply stood and stared. Japanese military hospitals had long since exhausted supplies of clean linens. Sheets were reused until they fell apart, often without washing between patients due to soap shortages and damaged laundry facilities. Nurses and patients alike had grown accustomed to sleeping on stained, threadbare fabric or on bare mattresses, accepting this as one of countless small degradations that total war required. The American sheets represented something beyond mere comfort. They represented a supply system so robust that disposable textiles could be provided even to enemy prisoners, an economy so productive that single-use items were the standard rather than the luxury, a society that valued hygiene and comfort even in the context of imprisonment. Over the following days, as the sheets were changed twice weekly with mechanical regularity, the white cotton became a recurring reminder that everything they had been taught about American weakness and resource scarcity was false. A nation that could provide clean sheets to prisoners was a nation with resources beyond anything Japan had commanded, even at the height of its empire. The first few days in the hospital were a process of continuous adjustment, as the Japanese women encountered systems and assumptions that contradicted their experience at every level. Meals arrived 3 times daily, in quantities that seemed excessive, with variety that included fresh vegetables and meat portions that would have been considered generous in pre-war Japan. The American authorities explained through translators that this was standard prisoner ration, not special treatment, and that medical personnel were monitoring the women's caloric intake, because many showed signs of malnutrition. The concept of monitoring prisoners for malnutrition, of treating enemy combatants' health as a responsibility rather than an inconvenience, was alien to women who had served in a military system where wounded enemy soldiers received minimal care, if any. But more striking than the food was the medical attention. Doctors and nurses conducted rounds daily, examining patients with instruments and attention that Japanese military medicine reserved for officers. Several women had chronic conditions, infections, dental problems, injuries improperly healed that had gone untreated during the war. American medical staff scheduled procedures to address these issues as routinely as if these were American patients, rather than recently hostile enemies. When Tanaka herself was told she needed minor surgery to correct damage from an improperly healed broken finger, she tried to decline, explaining that this was not necessary, that she could function adequately. The American surgeon, a woman in her 40s who spoke through an interpreter, said something Tanaka would never forget. "You're a medical professional. You know that function and health are not the same thing. We can fix this, so we will." The transformation in understanding accelerated as Tanaka and the other nurses began to grasp the full implications of a women-only hospital within the American military medical system. This was not a makeshift arrangement or a temporary expedient, but permanent infrastructure reflecting systematic policy. The American military, they learned, had determined that female personnel required separate medical facilities staffed by female doctors and nurses, that women's health needs were sufficiently distinct and important to warrant dedicated resources. The Oakland Naval Hospital Women's Wing included gynecology specialists, mental health professionals, physical therapists, and administrative staff, dozens of positions filled by women treating women, a parallel medical system that existed because American society possessed such abundance that it could afford specialization even in military medicine. For Tanaka, who had been trained in general nursing and then thrust into battlefield surgery because bodies were bodies and gender was irrelevant in triage, this was a conceptual revolution. The Americans were not claiming women were too delicate for general medicine, but rather that women's medical needs were specific enough, important enough, to deserve specialized attention. The Women's Wing had equipment for prenatal care, protocols for addressing sexual assault, counseling services for psychological trauma, systems that acknowledged realities of women's military service that Japanese culture had either denied or considered too shameful to address systematically. The evidence of how thoroughly American society valued and invested in women's health accumulated through countless small observations. The medical library in the Women's Wing included journals dedicated to women's health issues, reflecting ongoing research and development in obstetrics, gynecology, and female-specific concerns. The American nurses spoke casually of continuing education requirements, of specialization tracks, of professional advancement that was not limited by gender, but facilitated through women-only institutions. When Tanaka asked one of the senior American nurses how she had advanced to her position, the answer involved a combination of merit, additional education, and institutional support systems that seemed almost fantastical. Scholarships for advanced training, professional networks that connected female medical personnel, policies that prohibited discrimination in advancement. The American nurse spoke of these things as normal, expected parts of her career, not extraordinary accommodations, but basic institutional features. She had served in the Pacific Theater, had seen combat conditions, and had returned to a position of authority and respect. Her confidence was not the defensive assertion of worth that characterized educated Japanese women navigating a male-dominated society, but the casual self-assurance of someone whose value was institutionally recognized and systematically supported. The contrast between this and Tanaka's experience, where female medical professionals were essential but fundamentally subordinate, necessary but not valued, was so stark it was almost painful to contemplate. The sound that characterized the Women's Wing was not silence or the harsh efficiency of military discipline, but something gentler and more humane, the sound of conversation, laughter, the routine exchanges of professional women working together. American nurses talked as they worked, discussing cases, sharing information, occasionally joking in ways that would have been considered inappropriate in the Japanese military medical system, where hierarchy and formality governed all interactions. The Japanese women, accustomed to working in silence or speaking only when necessary, found this casualness unsettling at first. It seemed unprofessional, too relaxed, evidence of the lax discipline that Japanese propaganda claimed characterized American military culture. But as days became weeks, Tanaka began to recognize that the conversation was not evidence of poor discipline, but of functional teamwork. The American nurses shared information freely, challenged each other's assessments respectfully, collaborated in ways that transcended rigid hierarchy. A junior nurse could question a senior nurse's approach without fear of punishment, if she had legitimate medical grounds for her concern. Doctors solicited input from nurses rather than simply issuing orders. The result was not chaos, but a kind of collective competence that seemed more effective than the rigid top-down structure Tanaka was accustomed to. The sound of women's voices, confident and collaborative, became the acoustic signature of a system that treated female professionals as full participants rather than subordinate assistants, and that recognized communication as essential to effective medicine rather than a breach of discipline. By November 1945, as the Japanese women awaited repatriation, the experience at Oakland Naval Hospital had fundamentally altered how many understood both American society and their own positions as women. The abundance they had encountered, the clean sheets, plentiful food, well-equipped facilities, was impressive but comprehensible within framework of American economic superiority. More challenging was the systematic respect for women's autonomy and professional capacity that the hospital represented. The women's wing was not charity or condescension, but institutional recognition that women's needs mattered enough to allocate significant resources, that women's professional contributions were valuable enough to support with career development systems, that women's voices were important enough to be heard in collaborative decision-making. For Tanaka and the other nurses, who had served a military system that needed their skills but did not respect their persons, that relied on their labor but did not invest in their development, that demanded their sacrifice but did not protect their health, the contrast was transformative. They had expected imprisonment and found something closer to professional respect. They had anticipated scarcity and encountered abundance. They had been prepared for harsh treatment and received medical care better than they had provided to their own wounded soldiers. Systematic integration of women into American military. Medicine extended beyond the hospital, itself to the broader social context that the Japanese women glimpsed through interactions with staff and glimpses of American society. Female doctors were not rare exceptions, but represented a significant proportion of medical personnel, normalized through institutional support rather than celebrated as extraordinary. American servicewomen spoke casually of voting, of property rights, of legal protections that seemed impossible. To women from a society where wives could not open bank accounts without husbands' permission, and where married, women were legally subordinate to their husbands in virtually all matters. The American women had fought in a war and expected to return to civilian life with skills and experience that would enhance their opportunities, not diminish them. They spoke of using GI Bill benefits for education, of career plans that included advancement and leadership, of futures that were not limited to marriage and motherhood, even if those were chosen. For the Japanese nurses, many of whom faced uncertain futures in a defeated nation where traditional gender roles were reasserting themselves after the brief wartime expansion of women's opportunities, this vision of female possibility was both inspiring and melancholy. They were seeing a version of modernity that Japan had approached but never fully embraced, a society where women's potential was not merely tolerated but actively developed. In the final days before repatriation, Tanaka was invited to tour the main Oakland Naval Hospital complex, escorted by one of the senior American nurses who had taken interest in her story. The facility was vast, with specialized wings for different types of injuries and illnesses, research laboratories, rehabilitation centers, and training facilities for medical personnel. The American nurse explained that this was one of many such hospitals, part of a network that had been built specifically to handle the casualties of Pacific warfare, and that would be converted to veterans' care after the war. The scale was overwhelming. Entire buildings dedicated to physical therapy, wings for burn treatment, facilities for psychological rehabilitation. The American nurse mentioned almost casually that they were developing new techniques for treating combat trauma, including psychological approaches for what they were beginning to call post-traumatic stress. Japanese military medicine had no framework for psychological trauma beyond labeling it as weakness. The idea that mental wounds deserved treatment equivalent to physical injuries, that systems would be built to address them, that resources would be allocated to healing minds as well as bodies. It represented a conception of medicine and of human worth that Japanese military culture had never embraced. As they walked through corridors where wounded American servicemen received treatment that was attentive, comprehensive, and clearly expensive, Tanaka understood with painful clarity why Japan had lost the war. A nation that cared for its people this thoroughly, that invested this heavily in healing and rehabilitation, that treated even its enemies with medical attention, better than Japan provided its own warriors, such a nation possessed resources and values that no amount of martial spirit could overcome. The clean white sheets that had symbolized abundance became, by the time of departure in late November, something more complex, a symbol of the difference between societies that treated people as expendable resources versus societies that treated them as investments worthy of care. Japanese military culture had demanded sacrifice without providing support, had extracted labor and service without reciprocal obligation to protect or nurture. American culture, at least as manifested in the women's wing of Oakland Naval Hospital, operated on different principles: that people who served deserved care in return, that professionals required investment to maintain effectiveness, that women specifically warranted attention to needs that male-dominated systems ignored. The sheets were changed twice weekly with mechanical regularity, not because individual prisoners mattered to American authorities personally, but because systems were in place that treated all persons within their scope according to standardized protocols that assumed dignity and worth. This was not warmth or personal kindness, but something potentially more powerful: institutional respect embedded in procedures and resource allocation, a systematic recognition of human value that transcended individual relationships or cultural familiarity. For women who had served a system that demanded everything and provided minimal support in return, this procedural humanity was revelatory. When the transport ship departed San Francisco in late November, carrying Japanese women back to an uncertain future in occupied Japan, Tanaka stood on deck as she had on arrival, watching the American coast recede. She carried with her personal belongings, repatriation papers, and something less tangible but more transformative: an understanding that the world was larger and more various than Japanese military culture had allowed her to know. She had seen a vision of how societies could organize themselves around principles that valued professional competence over gender hierarchy, that invested in people systematically rather than exploiting them until exhaustion, that treated medical care as a right rather than a privilege. The clean sheets, the abundant food, the women doctors and confident nurses, the systems that protected and developed rather than merely demanded, all of it had been real. Not propaganda or performance, but everyday reality in a society with resources and values fundamentally different from what she had known. In the decades that would follow, as Japan rebuilt and wrestled with questions of modernity and tradition, Tanaka would remember those weeks at Oakland Naval Hospital as a glimpse of what was possible, a vision of a world where women could be professionals and persons simultaneously, where institutional structures supported rather than suppressed, where abundance created options rather than scarcity forcing sacrifice. The memory of white sheets, crisp and clean and changed with mechanical regularity, would remain with her as a symbol not of American superiority in some jingoistic sense, but of the simple profound truth that societies which invested in their people, all their people including and especially their women, created strength that went deeper than weapons or tactics. Japan had lost the war in part because it had never understood that half its population represented potential that scarcity and tradition had left undeveloped, that women could be not just supporters of male achievement, but achievers themselves if given tools and respect. America had won not just through industrial might, but through systematic development of all its human resources, through institutions that nurtured rather than merely demanded, through values that recognized investment in people as investment in national strength. The sound of women's voices, confident and collaborative, faded as the ship moved into open ocean, but Tanaka carried that sound with her, carried the memory of what was possible when societies built institutions that recognized women not as problems to be managed, but as resources to be developed, not as subordinates to be directed, but as professionals to be respected, not as expendable tools, but as human beings worthy of clean sheets and comprehensive care and futures limited only by talent rather than gender.